Hello and welcome to the Talking About podcast, brought to you by ARU's Counselling and Wellbeing team. Talking About is a space to openly discuss the topic of wellbeing and mental health in a way that puts our students' thoughts and feelings at the forefront. My name is Lucas Oliver and I'm a counsellor at ARU. I'm joined today by Amy Wright, postgraduate researcher and peer wellbeing mentor at ARU, and Rak Singh, Cambridge team leader at Change Grow Live. In this episode, we're going to be talking about drugs and alcohol. Okay, so it's great to be here today to talk about drugs and alcohol. I've got with me a student from ARU, Amy Wright. Hello to you, Amy.
Hello, thank you for having me today.
Great to have you here. And we've got Rak Singh from CGL, Change Grow Live. Hello to you.
Hello, Lucas. Yeah, really good to be here.
Would you like to just tell us your role and obviously a bit about the organisation you represent?
So I'm one of the managers who's based at the Cambridge site of Change Grow Live, or CGL, and we provide free support and advice to anyone over 18 who's affected by drugs or alcohol.
So perfectly accessible for our students. And we do also have the ability to, if you present to counselling and wellbeing, for us to signpost and support you to go there, don't we, Rak? We've been working together.
Yeah. And, we're really keen to kind of keep those conversations going and increase that dialogue, to be honest, because there is quite a lot of hidden harm, I suspect, in terms of people at ARU or other students and the younger adult population who are experiencing problems with drugs or alcohol, but perhaps don't feel empowered or safe or, able to encourage or to access that support.
Yes, I think it's one of those hard things, isn't it? Actually, when to know when we might have a problem. Turning to you there, Amy, really, on that one, what do you think about that question for students?
I think that's a really important point to consider, is that there's a lot of peer pressure around drinking. There's a lot of vulnerability when you start university. A lot of students do turn to drugs and alcohol. And it's kind of one of the sort of generic social constructs that happens when you go to university. So I think recognizing maybe signs of excessive drug and alcohol use is a really important thing to shine a spotlight on. I don't think it's something that a lot of students really consider. So I think a question for Rak would be, how can you notice in yourself if you are using drugs and alcohol excessively?
Can I just start off by saying there's a questionnaire that it's a screening tool essentially, and it's called the CAGE questionnaire. And essentially it's 4 questions and with the acronym CAGE. And the first question is, have you felt that you've had to cut down your use of either drugs or alcohol? So that's the C in CAGE. The second question being, do you ever feel annoyed by people pointing out, how much you're using or drinking or complaining about your use? The third, the G in CAGE, that stands for guilt. So do you feel guilty about the fact that, that your use is the impact that it's having on your life? Are you doing things that you regret that you otherwise wouldn't have done if you hadn't used drugs or alcohol? So those are things to be thinking about. And then the fourth screening question is the eye opener. So are you using drugs or alcohol first thing in the morning to kind of get through the withdrawal or kind of the blues after your use of drugs or alcohol?
I wonder if there are other eye openers as well, really noticing if we're drinking on any type of emotions or discomforts.
I would say, I think it's important that we need to think about not stigmatizing people who are using drugs and alcohol. And I know in university settings, sometimes there's kind of quite a punitive approach and there's a disciplinary approach to the use of drugs or alcohol. But I guess the use of drugs and alcohol is very commonplace. It's, incredibly widespread. And there being a safe space for people to come and access help is really important. And to reduce the shame, really, because I do think accessing help earlier, sooner rather than later is preferable. A stitch in time saves 9.
Yeah, I think that's something very common to the way the counselling and wellbeing services and, of course, the way CGL would operate. That the police or anyone, they're quite happy when people seek help for drugs and alcohol. So we operate a confidential service just as much as you do, Rak. So I think that message is important to go out, that they want to tackle this through people getting help.
And some other things, Amy, as well, I'd think about is, if you aren't honouring commitments that you make to yourself or to other people, you don't turn up for appointments or lectures, it's a sign that things are progressing in a worrying direction.
I think noticing this in yourself, all that you've said is really useful information, but what about noticing it in a peer, maybe a family, a friend, a relative? How could you go about noticing these signs of excessive drug and alcohol use and doing something about that?
I think, unfortunately, denial of the severity of the impact of your use is a hallmark of problematic use of drugs and alcohol. So listening without judgment, I think, can be really helpful. And offering information, if anyone listening today can offer that kind of listening ear to somebody that they feel maybe has got a problem with drugs or alcohol, and kind of opening up that conversation, really.
What are the ways to try to get around the defensiveness, right? Because it would be really natural, wouldn't it, to meet any sort of accusations or judgments with defensiveness. I think we all do it. So any tips in particular for how to handle that defensive reaction, forestall it?
I guess it's to expect that in the first instance. It's a process. Coming to acknowledge and accept the severity of the impact that drugs and alcohol are having on your life. Yeah, it's a process. So I think if you're a concerned other, just being there, really, being emotionally present and listening, and then offering kind of information about where to get support.
Maybe asking people what their concerns might be, especially that open-ended question. I say, what concerns do you have about your drinking?
Yeah.
Or drug use?
A common thing that they say in recovery circles is your use of drugs or alcohol, is it costing you more than money? And, the misconception that alcoholics or addicts are people who kind of drink out of bottles and park benches or stealing to fund their heroin addiction. The reality is problematic drug and alcohol use affects everyone, regardless of age, race, religion, social class, nationality, anything really, right across the board. So realizing that you can have a problem with drugs or alcohol, but it's progressive. And just because things haven't gotten as bad as you've lost a job or you've lost a relationship doesn't mean that it's not impacting. And I guess focusing on someone's feelings, how is your use of drugs or alcohol making you feel? Are you feeling ashamed? And like we touched on about, are you feeling guilty about the things that you've done?
I think leading from what you said there, do you think there's a bit of a stereotype in the media, in entertainment perhaps, for stereotyping of addicts? So, for example, it might be someone drinking a bottle of vodka for breakfast. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Certainly the use of alcohol, to just mention one drug, has become a lot more widespread through COVID and lockdown. People weren't getting access to their usual support networks and their usual activities, and were turning to drugs like alcohol to kind of cope with those feelings of isolation and a lack of connection, really. And there's a really good TED talk. It's gone viral. It's got millions of views, by Johann Hari. And he essentially talks about the opposite of addiction being connection. So connecting in healthy ways, whether it be to nature, whether it be to healthy social networks, whether it be to a passion or purpose or direction of some kind, is incredibly healing. And that's actually quite a basic human need. And when people are trying to meet those basic human needs in unhealthy ways, like using a substance, I guess they're more vulnerable to getting problems.
So you're almost saying that drugs and alcohol can be a void that, from meeting those needs that they sort of pour into if we're not careful.
It's a paradox, really. People use those substances to meet those needs, but consequently, they get even further from what they need.
It ends up getting in the way.
Yeah. Another way of thinking about it is, quite often use starts off quite fun, then it becomes fun with problems, and then eventually you get to the point where your use is just causing you problems and it's not really much fun anymore.
Yeah, what are the seductive elements there for students, Amy?
I think one thing that I have thought quite a lot about is that drinking culture is very heavy as a student. A lot of social engagement is centered around drinking and perhaps maybe even drug use. there's often a thought that this might calm down as you get a little bit older. You might think, oh, I'll get a job and I'll be drinking less post-university. But is it right to assume that will, is it kind of, I guess what I'm trying to say is that safe to assume?
I'd say that may be the case for a lot of people at university, but I would say that there will be a significant percentage, a significant minority of people who will go on to develop significant problems with either alcohol or drugs. You know, I don't mind sharing, I've got lived experience of alcoholism and recovery. And my alcoholism really took off at university. In a way, it was kind of the perfect storm of conditions for my alcoholism to flourish. You know, I was away from home, I had more autonomy, less oversight from my parents and other restrictive factors. But then there were the social, and you know, you mentioned it, Amy, everything was centered around alcohol. And there was this culture of acceptability of drinking heavily and problematically. It was just kind of par for the course, really. So my alcoholism went under the radar.
How much does laughing it all off play, do you think, Rak?
Oh, I think quite a big part of, I kind of rebranded myself as this kind of Oliver Reed kind of figure who, you know, instead of acknowledging the shame of some of the things that were happening, it was much easier just to kind of pretend like it was all, I was the life and the soul of the party.
What advice would you have for students who are interacting with drugs and alcohol for the first time, gaining this sense of freedom when going to university?
I would just say be informed, you know, kind of do your research and look to your experience as well as, you know, are you experiencing any of the things that we've talked about already on this podcast? You know, another danger sign is when things that you would previously have thought were unacceptable kind of become acceptable. So, for example, some people start off saying, well, they'll never drive under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And then soon enough, it kind of becomes commonplace. So if there's that kind of progression, then that's a bit of a worrying sign.
I remember someone saying about getting honest being so significant. What do you think about that?
I mean, it's incredibly important, but I guess people can only be as honest as they're able to be at that time. I guess having safe space in order to be honest is important. You know, quite often people access mutual aid recovery meetings like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, because there they can kind of find understanding and empathy without judgment, really, because there are people there who have that lived experience.
And it allows people to get honest with themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
One other thing that I would think is quite relevant for students is there's maybe a level of social anxiety. They use alcohol as a bit of a confidence boost. I know I've certainly done this in the past. You go to a party, there's a lot of strangers there. You think, okay, I'll have a glass of wine with my friends before and I'll be in a much more confident place. I'll be able to speak to these new people. So what advice would you have around that specifically?
I mean, I think there's no denying that alcohol can be an incredibly effective tool in the short term for managing issues like that. It's a social lubricant, but the reality is it's quite a powerful drug that has an impact on your brain chemistry and consequently your mood. And I guess it's, you know, we can easily forget that depending on the setting that you're in as well, but it's to just realize that that's the case. And there are actually more effective ways of managing social anxiety than taking like a powerful drug like alcohol, really. And, you know, there's meditation, there's mindfulness, there's breathing techniques, diet and exercise are massive. These are all kind of, but they don't offer that kind of quick fix that alcohol does. But there are consequences to, you know, to using alcohol.
You are what you eat, including the substances you take in.
Yeah.
And that's what I was wondering as well, Amy, about the belonging that we could get through being tempted to use other drugs. I mean, alcohol's damaging, but I suppose we should mention some other substances.
Yeah, and I think it's important to consider, I guess, gateway drugs. They're kind of used as a generic term for one type of drug that will lead you down a path of taking other ones. So perhaps alcohol is even the gateway drug to more physical hard drugs, like perhaps ketamine, cocaine, MDMA. I wonder, do you see in your service a particular drug perhaps as the kind of the big bad guy, or are they all equally as damaging?
Absolutely. They kind of have damaging effects in a whole variety of different ways. And I should say that we don't tend to have younger adults in the kind of the age range of people accessing, student services. We don't have very many people accessing support with our service at the moment in that age group. And I guess that's probably why conversations like this is particularly important, because as I'd said, a stitch in time saves nine. So if you feel that things are becoming problematic, knowing that you can get help sooner rather than later is really important. In terms of the drugs of that people use accessing our service, cannabis and cocaine predominantly are the most common ones. But I know for a fact from a lot of different kind of surveys and reports that the use of ketamine and MDMA is incredibly widespread, especially in kind of student populations. I guess we just don't tend to see people accessing help for those.
Because I've heard about some of the physical potential effects from heavy ketamine use. Can be quite concerning on the bladder and things, right?
Absolutely. And unfortunately irreversible.
Okay, right. So what are the sorts that sounds important for young people in particular to be able to spot those signs early?
Yeah, so ketamine is particularly damaging to the bladder, as you say. So things like frequent urination, needing to go to the loo every 10 to 15 minutes becomes like a feature of that.
It's quite stark.
Yeah.
Wow. And then anything...
And painful urination as well. And abdominal pain associated with that.
Right. And any other signs like discoloration in the urine or anything, or blood in the urine? Anything?
Yes.
I see. Yeah, right. So there's something to really pay attention to and get yourself to a urologist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so
I suppose if you were concerned about this particular thing, are you able to signpost maybe listeners to any forms of support, extra information about, I guess, more the medical side of it?
There are lots of resources online. So Talk to Frank is quite a common one that people have heard of. They offer free and confidential advice for people, but they've also got a lot of online resources as well. So in terms of people accessing our service, we have doctors, nurses, and psychologists and a whole range of other professionals actually working within our service. But quite often we can liaise with people's GPs to make sure that they get referrals for the important support that more specialist support that they require.
And actually, that's an important one, right? Because you can go straight to your GP. In fact, you should if you're worried about, and you're using ketamine, and you have any ideas about your bladder.
I would say your GP is your first port of call, really.
Yeah, and it's really the objective would be to get a referral to the urologist. So cannabis, I'm glad you mentioned that one, because that can be a sneaky number, can't it? Especially at university, where it can appear quite normalized sometimes, Amy?
Definitely. And I think especially because it's in media a lot more, it's being legalized in some countries. We've now got CBD oil being legalized in the UK. So I think that is one. And I think a lot of my peers would see that as a step down from the harder drugs. So I think they kind of think of alcohol as one thing, cannabis is a next step, and then you've got your more class A drugs. So I think there's almost a bit of a stigma about whether cannabis is as bad as the other ones.
And it depends how you use it, Rak, as you probably see.
Sure. And, we get people accessing our service who are habitual users. They're kind of waking up and spliffing up first thing in the morning and kind of smoking through the day. But it's interesting, Amy, that you talked about different classifications of drugs of abuse. And, you could argue again that alcohol would be reclassified as a class A drug in terms of the effects that it has on individuals and on society. But with cannabis, it can have a very profound impact on people's mental health, on their mood, on their motivation.
Yeah, how does that work? If someone's taking cannabis early in the morning, in terms of motivation, how the rest of their day goes, what do we see?
I mean, if you spliff up first thing in the morning, how motivated are you going to be potentially to do?
I think with students, what's quite interesting as well is that you have some drugs which spark some sort of creative aspect of your mind. So I guess it's thinking about, obviously, some might see that as a benefit if it's making them more productive, they're doing a creative sort of degree, if it's giving them ideas. But I think the negative, the drawback needs to be as widely understood as potentially what that positive after taking the drug would be.
I wonder about that it almost tends to give the drugs the credit, maybe in a way that it doesn't allow the person themselves to get that sense of achievement.
Yeah, absolutely. It's to what extent are those creative urges and impulses and instincts present anyway? And almost the use of the substance kind of gives that person permission to kind of engage in that stuff.
I think that's quite interesting. It links back to when we were speaking about confidence with alcohol. It's like, to what extent are you socially confident, or is that the alcohol talking? It's like, do you take a claim? And are you proud of yourself for speaking to those 5 new people at a particular party or event you might have gone to? Or do we thank the alcohol for that?
Yeah, that sounds like it's really important in terms of how we grow as a person. What do you notice about that for people who come to the service rack, their levels of self-esteem and confidence?
Incredibly low, I would say, right across the board. I guess people tend to access services when they've experienced significant consequences from their use of drugs or alcohol. Why else would you access a service unless you had experienced consequences? But by that time, unfortunately, people have experienced problems in their relationships, jobs, with their health, in their families, in basically every area of their life. And the extent to which that drug and alcohol use affects that person's self-esteem, their very being, actually, it's very profound. And the good news is, in recovery, people kind of can regain that authenticity and that self-esteem and that confidence and flourish in life, absolutely. Even the thing I always try to offer people when they come and get support at our service is hope. Things feel really bad at the moment, but there is definitely hope.
Yeah, I've heard it said that it can feel like running without lead boots on in the end, in recovery. So we may not always notice such dramatic physical impacts, I guess, as the ketamine example, but what about those more subtle things, perhaps on mood and mental health, Rack?
It's definitely worth mentioning that, drugs are effective because they cause pleasurable effects, but they're impacting on your brain chemistry quite significantly. And so something like MDMA, for example, you have massive feelings of euphoria for a few hours, and then the come down can be quite significant and last for many days. And quite often people then use other drugs to mitigate the effects of that come down, whether it be alcohol or cannabis, to kind of smooth those edges out. Similarly with cocaine, which is a stimulant and obviously quite short acting comparatively, but can make people feel really chatty and confident and quite obnoxious, really. But again, the come down, that's off the back of that. And especially people quite often use cocaine in conjunction with alcohol. And when you use alcohol and cocaine together, it forms a toxic byproduct called cocaethylene, which has very significant impact, especially on your heart, and can be very dangerous. And again, it's not something that people are commonly aware of in terms of the way in which those drugs are interacting. And it's worth thinking about polydrug use here as well, because quite often people won't be using just one substance. They'll kind of be using like a smorgasbord of different things and coming up and coming down and mixing them all about.
Yeah, we are aware, of course, the impact that alcohol can have on the liver, but you mentioned that cocaethylene, I understand, hardens the liver potentially faster than alcohol alone.
Yeah. Alcohol affects every single organ system in the body. Yeah. So it's not just the liver, it's pretty much everything. But that's when it's sustained use over a prolonged period of time. But unfortunately, even younger people can experience kind of quite significant problems if they're unlucky, in their 20s.
So we're also noticing perhaps that we're just feeling down in the dumps, maybe even a few days after those things like MDMA and ecstasy, cocaine use. Any idea what people do to offset those mood effects if they're into taking drugs?
The problem is people then use more drugs to kind of combat those mood disorders. And then that just compounds the problem. You're in this kind of vicious cycle, aren't you? Whereas managing those kind of mood disturbances in healthier ways, such as, mindfulness, meditation, diet and exercise are both massive, to be honest. Even keeping hydrated is quite important, just drinking plenty of water, getting plenty of sunlight, I know these sound like very kind of common things, but quite often when you're in a problematic cycle with drugs and alcohol, you're not doing a lot of those things for yourself.
How long would some of these drugs stay in your system if you were on your come down and then perhaps taking another drug to counteract that? Are they still mixing in your system even days after you've taken them?
I think it depends on the particular drug you're taking, Amy, and the half-life of that drug. But, I know the mood disturbance from taking MDMA, for example, can last many days. People talk about the Tuesday blues, the Saturday night kind of partying, and then feeling quite low in mood Monday, Tuesday, kind of affecting the rest of your week, really.
And what effects does it have on sleep patterns that compound that, Rick?
Incredibly disturbed sleep. For most of those drugs have a profile that cause disturbed sleep patterns. And again, that compounds mood. So getting 8 hours a day is quite key, actually, for your mood and well-being. And if you take a stimulant like cocaine or MDMA, then obviously that's going to impact. And the thing about alcohol is you don't get healthy natural sleep. You don't get that REM sleep when you're drinking quite heavily. It's a central nervous system depressant, so you're just basically knocking yourself out.
And you said, I know you didn't mean to say a day, but of course you might be sleeping during the day if you've been taking drugs, and that nightly sleep pattern is completely skew with.
It's such an important thing for students to consider as well, because I think out of all of kind of the demographics, they are one that especially have such a unnatural sleep pattern sometimes. You've got your exam revision, your assignments, your partying. So I think that has quite a big effect on students' sleep patterns. So drugs as well on top of that, I suppose, could have an even larger effect there.
It's a very good point. And then, of course, some students are maybe working in the nighttime economy. They're working on top of that. And, of course, the temptation, finding drugs within that nighttime economy is probably another factor. So I guess what we want to really promote is the idea of early intervention, having those conversations, coming to a place like Counselling and Wellbeing or CGL where you can have a conversation with a non-judgmental person to explore the impact it's having on your life. What facilities do you have for that, Rack?
So people can literally ring up and ask for support and advice over the phone. People can walk into our service at any point, and we're just at the end of Mill Road on the Brookfields Hospital site.
I was just going to ask, is it self-referral or can you refer your friends, your family?
So most people self-refer, but we do accept referrals from professionals like GPs and mental health professionals as well. But we're a voluntary service, Amy, so the person has got to want that help. So you can encourage people to self-refer, if that makes sense. And then we can receive professional referrals. But the majority of people actually just walk in or phone up themselves, and we tell them how to get that support and help. And you can literally just walk in and we can assess you on that day.
Wow, that's really positive. And certainly we have tried to facilitate that as well through counselling and wellbeing and had a good response. So we'll keep up the good work together, I hope. Any final questions from you, Amy?
I think one thing I would like to ask is, you've mentioned some resources and materials as we've been speaking. Do you have anything else to add? Anything to raise awareness on drug and alcohol use, excessive use, or just resources that might signpost students to maybe your support, other pieces of support?
So yes, so we've got a website, so people can get more information on our website. I would recommend that people access kind of self-help support groups as well, mutual aid communities. These are communities of people who are recovering from or who've had problems with drugs or alcohol in the past. We've got the Edge Cafe, which is right next door to us on Mill Road, and that's a social enterprise. A lot of people who work there have lived experience of either drug or alcohol problems or mental health issues, but they offer a whole range of different groups and activities as well. I really do think that kind of connection is really important, because addiction's an incredibly isolating experience. So connection in healthy ways is where it's at, really.
And what to do instead, isn't it? It's so easy to say, well, just stop. Just don't do drugs and alcohol. It's like saying, don't think of a pink elephant. What do you think of? And so having something to do instead is really important.
That's a really good point, Lucas. If people could just stop, then they would.
Absolutely, it'd be so easy.
Yeah. So people need to think about ways in which to meet their needs in a healthier way, I would say.
Absolutely. I think there's no better place to end there. Thank you so much, Rak, for coming and telling us about the service, and Amy for your great questions. Lovely to have you here for talking about drugs and alcohol.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today to talk about drugs and alcohol. If you've been affected by anything we've spoken about in this episode, please reach out to the Counselling Wellbeing team and make the most of the support we can offer you. Visit aiu.ac.uk/wellbeing to find out more about our service and how to get in touch. Join us next time for an in-depth discussion about managing unstable emotions.